God as the Creator, God as good, and God as the real. Taken from the ALETHEON, Volume 1, page 107. The divine avataric self-revelation of his divine presence, Avatar Adidar Samraj. Conventional God religion originates in the state of mind that characterizes the first three stages of life. Thus, conventional God religion is ego-based, and it serves the functional desire of the egoic or phenomenal self to be protected, nourished, pleasurized, and ultimately preserved. The phenomenal self or egoic self-centered body-mind complex is the source of conventional God religion, as well as all of the other ordinary and extraordinary pursuits of born existence in the first 6 stages of life. Therefore, it is not real God, but the ego, perhaps gesturing conceptually toward God, that is the source and fundamental subject of popular or exoteric religion, as well as higher mysticism. Real transcendental spiritual life begins only when the ego, with all of its mind, emotion, desire, and activity, is thoroughly understood and thereby transcended. For this reason, only by me revealed and given radical and perfectly ego-transcending reality teaching of the 7th stage of life directly serves the process of most perfect real God realization. All other forms of doctrine or instruction serve the purposes of the first 6 stages of life, all of which are founded on the egoic presumption of self and other. It is the culture of conventional religion that promotes conventional ideas about God. The principal conventional God idea is that God is the creator or intentional emanator of the worlds and all beings. Such seems an obvious idea to the bodily ego, trapped in the mechanics of the perceptual mind and the material or elemental vision. The ego is identified with embodiment, and the idea of the creator God is developed to account for the fact and to provide a conceptual basis in the form of the idea of the ego as God-made creature. For the appeal to God to help the ego in this world and in the yet unknown after-death state. The difficulty with the Creator God conception is that it identifies God with ultimate causation and thus makes God inherently responsible for the subsequent causation of all effects. And if God is responsible for all effects, then God is clearly a very powerful but also terrible deity, since conditionally manifested existence tends to work both for and against all creatures. Therefore, in conventional religious thinking, the Creator God idea, both opposite and opposed to evil, Creator God idea is commonly coupled with the idea of God as good, and thus both opposite and opposed to evil. If the Creator God is conceived to be good, or always working to positively create, protect, nourish, rightly and pleasurably fulfill, and ultimately preserve all of conditional nature and all creatures, insofar as they are rightly aligned to God, then the ego is free of the emotional double bind and the anger and despair that would seem to be justified if God is simply the reasonable creator of everything good, bad, or in between. Therefore, conventional religious theology is founded on both the idea of God as creator and the idea of God as good or goodwill. However, if God is the all-powerful creator, except for whose activities not anything has been made, then how did so much obviously negative or evil motion and effect come into existence? The usual answer is generally organized around one or another mythological story in which powerful creatures, or one powerful creature such as Satan, regarded to personify evil, entered on the basis of free will into a pattern of sin or disobedience and conflict in relation to God, which resulted in separation from God and a descent or fall into gross material bondage, and so forth. Such mythologies are structured in terms of a hierarchical view of conditional nature, with various planes descending from the heaven of God. Religion thus becomes a method of attempting to return to God. Exoteric religion, or the God religion of the first three stages of life, is generally based on an appeal to belief, social morality, and magically effective prayer or worship. The return to God is basically conceived in terms of this world, and therefore exoteric or terrestrial religion is actually a process in which God returns to the ego and to this world, rather than vice versa, and it is believed that God will eventually reclaim humankind and the total world from the forces of evil. Nevertheless, exoteric religion is an outer cult intended for grosser egos and for mass consumption, or the culture of the first three stages of life. The most advanced form of conventional God religion is the esoteric or inner cult, which is a mystical society open only to those chosen for initiation and thus growth or development into the fourth and fifth stages of life. Esoteric God religion is a process of cosmic mysticism, or the method of return to God by ascending as mind or disembodied soul back through the root of the original fall into matter and evil until the heaven or eternal abode of God is reached again. The esoteric mystical process goes beyond the conventions of exoteric religion to develop the psychophysical mechanics of mystical flight and return to God via the hierarchical structures of the nervous system, ascending from the plane of evil or Satan or the flesh at the bodily base of the nervous system to the plane of God or the plane of good or the heavenly abode, at or above the brain via the magic carpet of the life force in the nervous system. Thus, the idea of the Creator God leads to the idea that God is good or goodwill, which leads to the idea that creatures have that creatures have free will, which then accounts for the appearance of sin, suffering, evil, and loss of God consciousness. And conventional God religion then becomes the means through structures of belief, sacramental worship, mystical prayer, yogic or shamanistic ascent, and so forth, for the re-exercise of creaturely free will in the direction of God, good, the triumph over evil and death in this world, and the ascent from material form and consciousness to spiritual, heavenly, or godly form and consciousness. All the popular religious traditions of humankind and all the mystical spiritual traditions of humankind tend to be associated with this chain of conceptions, or the characteristic ideas of the first 5 stages of life. It is only in the 6th stage traditions that these ideas begin to give way to different conceptions. It is only in the 6th stage of life that the egoic basis of the first 5 stages of life is penetrated. And it is only in the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life that the ego is most perfectly transcended in the divine reality itself. The theological and general religious conceptions I have just described have always been subject to criticism, or at least simple non-belief, on the part of those who are not persuaded by religious and theological arguments. Atheism, or the conception that no creator God or any other greater reality exists, has always opposed theism or God religion. Nevertheless, atheistic ideas are the product of the same fundamental egoic consciousness that otherwise produces theistic or conventional religious ideas. Atheism is the product of the ego, or the phenomenal self grounded in elemental perception, and so also is theism. Atheism, like exoteric God religion, extends itself only into the domain of the first three stages of life, whereas esoteric God religion provides a means for entering mystically and spiritually into the developmental process of the fourth stage of life and the fifth stage of life. Atheism regularly proposes a logic of life that has its own dogmatic features. It does not propose a God idea, but instead founds itself on and in the perceptual and phenomenal mind alone. Atheism concedes only a universal and ultimately indifferent or merely lawful cosmic nature, not of God, and so there is no need to create a religious creation myth to account for suffering. And atheistic thinkers thus generally confine themselves to constructing cosmology based on material observances alone, that merely accounts for the apparent workings of the conditionally manifested events of cosmic nature. Indeed, just as conventional God religion or conventional theism arises to account for suffering, atheism arises on the basis of the unreserved acknowledgement of suffering. And if there is no idea of God, there is no idea of the human being as creature, or, in other words, the human being as the bearer of an immortal or godlike inner part. Nor is there any need to interpret unfortunate or painful events as the effects of evil. Therefore, the atheistic point of view is characterized by the trend of mind called realism, just as the conventional religious or theistic point of view is characterized by the trend of mind called idealism. But both atheism and theism arise on the basis of the self-contraction or the ego of phenomenal self-consciousness, rather than on the basis of direct intuition of the real self-nature, self-condition, and self-state that is prior to separate self and its conventions of perception and thought. The realistic or atheistic view is just as much the bearer of a myth or a merely conceptual interpretation of the world as is the conventional religious or theistic view. Atheism or conventional realism is a state of mind which is based in the phenomenal self and which seeks the ultimate protection, nourishment, pleasure, and preservation of the phenomenal self, at least in this world, and if there should be an afterlife, then also in any other world. Therefore, atheism or conventional realism is simply a philosophical alternative to theism or conventional God religion, based on the same principle in consciousness, which is the phenomenal ego, and seeking by alternative means to fulfill the conditionally manifested self and relieve it of its suffering. Atheism or conventional realism is a state of mind that possesses individuals who are fixed in the first three stages of life. It is a form of spiritual neurosis or ego possession, as are all of the characteristic mind states of the first six stages of life. Esoteric God religion provides a basis for certain remarkable individuals to enter the fourth stage of life and the fifth stage of life, but the commonly or exoterically religious individual is, like the atheist, a relatively adolescent, if not childish, and even infantile character, fixed in the ego-possessed states characteristic of the first three stages of life. Atheism proposes a myth and a method for ego fulfillment that is based on phenomenal realism rather than religious idealism or the culture of the conventional God idea. Therefore, atheism is traditionally associated with the philosophy of materialism, just as theism is associated with creationism and emanationism, and conventional or mystical or fourth and fifth stage spirituality. And the realistic or atheistic view tends to be the foundation for all kinds of political, social, and technological movements, since its orientation is toward the investigation and manipulation of material nature. Atheism is realism and materialism. It is about the acquisition of knowledge about conditional nature and the exploitation of that knowledge to command or gain over conditional nature. And it is this scheme of knowledge and power, expressed as political and technological means of all kinds, that is the basis of the mythology and quasi-religion of atheism. The atheistic or non-theistic view of life is ego-based, organized relative to conditional nature as an elemental or grossly perceived process, and committed to knowledge and power as the means of salvation or material fulfillment of egoity. In this late time or dark epoch, the materialistic, realistic, and non-theistic philosophy of ego fulfillment is represented by the global culture of scientific, technological, and political materialism. The entire race of humankind is now being organized by the cultural movement of scientific materialism, which counters and even seeks to suppress the alternative cultures of exoteric religion, esoteric mysticism, transcendental self-realization, and divine enlightenment. Scientism, or the culture of realistic or materialistic knowledge and its two arms of power, technology and political order, are the primary forces in global culture of the present time. And humanity at large is thus tending to be reduced to the robotic acculturations of orderly egoism in the limited terms represented by humanity's functional development in the first three stages of life. Conventional and popular human culture has historically been limited to the conflicts and alternatives represented by theism and atheism, or egoic idealism and egoic realism. And the large-scale ordering of humankind has always tended to be dominated by the politics of materialistic knowledge and power. It is simply that in the late time or dark epoch, the materialistic culture is approaching the status of a worldwide mass culture in which all individuals will be controlled by a powerful and materialistically oriented system of political and technological restriction. The usual and most commonly remarked criticism of theism or conventional God religion is based on the evidence of suffering and material limitation. Therefore, the common arguments against theism are generally those proposed by the point of view of atheism. Likewise, the common arguments against atheism are generally those proposed by theism, which are based on an egoic appeal to the evidence of religious history, cultic revelation, mystical psychology, and psychic experience. For this reason, there may seem to be only two basic cultural alternatives, atheism and theism. Theism and conventional God religion are, at base, an expression of egoity in the first three stages of life, just as is the case with atheism and conventional materialism. Therefore, whenever theism or conventional God religion becomes the base for political and social order, it inevitably becomes the base for knowledge and power in the material world, and exoterically theistic regimes have historically been equally as aggressive in the manipulation and the suppression of humanity as have atheistic regimes. Exoteric theism is, at its base, egoic and fitted to worldly concerns. Therefore, when it achieves worldly power, it simply adopts the same general materialistic means that are adopted by atheism. Knowledge and power of the common tool are the common tools of egoity, not merely the tools of atheism. In its esoteric forms, theism, or conventional God religion, can, via the exercises and attainments of saints and mystics, simply apply knowledge and power to purposes that extend beyond the first three stages of life. However, In the terms of the first three stages of life, or the common and practical social order, theism or conventional God religion is inclined to make the same demands of social consciousness and to apply fundamentally the same kind of political and authoritarian techniques for achieving obedience and order as atheism and scientism. And the more important esoteric matters of spiritual wisdom, mystical knowledge, and the transformative power of sainthood or adeptship are as much in doubt and disrepute in the common religious circles of theism as they are in scientific and atheistic circles. All of this is to indicate that conventional God religion or theism, and even all religious, spiritual and transcendental pursuits of the first six stages of life, share root error or limitation with atheism and worldly culture. The error or limitation is the ego itself, or the presumptions and the seeking that are most basic to the conception of an independent phenomenal self in a less than hospitable phenomenal world. Thus, what is ultimately to be criticized in conventional God religion or theism is the same limit that is to be criticized in atheism and materialism. It is the ego, the phenomenal self-base, from which people tend to derive their conceptions of God, cosmic nature, life, and destiny. It is only when the egoic root of one's functional, worldly, and religious or spiritual life is inspected, understood, and transcended that self and world and real God are seen in truth. Therefore, it is necessary to understand your own egoic activity. It is necessary to aspire to wisdom, truth, and enlightenment. All occupations derived from the ego base are necessarily limited to egoity, and all conceptions that feed such egoic occupations are necessarily bereft of the right view of self, world, and real God, which is the causal divine reality and truth. When the mechanics of egoity are transcended in self-understanding, then it becomes obvious that life, or conditionally manifested phenomenal existence, is simply a play of opposites. Neither good or creation and preservation, nor evil or destruction finally wins. Conditional nature, in all its planes, is inherently a dynamic. The play of conditional nature in all its forms and beings and processes is not merely or exclusively and finally seeking the apparent good of self-preservation or the preservation and fulfillment of any particular form, world, or being, nor is it merely or exclusively and finally seeking the apparent evil of self-destruction or the dissolution of any particular form, world, or being. Rather, the play in conditional nature is always in the direction of perpetuating the dynamics of the play itself, and therefore polarity, opposition, struggle, alternation, death, and cyclic repetition tend to be perpetuated as the characteristics of phenomenal existence. Therefore, the play of conditional nature is always alternating between the appearance of dominance by one or the other of its two basic extremes. The sign of this is the inherent struggle that involves every conditionally apparent form, being, and process. The struggle is this dynamic play of opposites, but the import of it is not the absolute triumph of either half. Things and beings and processes arise, they move, they are transformed, and they disappear. No conditionally apparent thing or being or process is ultimately preserved, nor by contrast is there any absolute destruction. Cosmic nature is a transformer, not merely a creator or a destroyer. To the ego or present temporary form of being, self-preservation may seem to be the inevitable motive of being. Therefore, a struggle develops to destroy or escape the dynamic of conditional nature by dominating evil or death with good or immortality. This idea gets expressed in the generally exoteric and occidental and more materialistic efforts to conquer conditional nature via worldly knowledge and power. However, It also gets expressed in the generally esoteric and oriental or more mystical efforts to escape the plane of conditional nature by ascent from materiality or the evil of the flesh to heaven, the good God above the realm of conditional nature. When the ego or self-contraction is understood and transcended, then conditional nature is seen in the light of reality itself. And in that case, the egoic struggle in conditional nature or against conditional nature is also understood and transcended. Then life ceases to be founded on the need to defeat the dynamic of conditional nature via conditional knowledge, power, immortality, or mystical escape. The world is no longer conceived as a drama of warfare between good and evil. The righteousness of the search for the good as a means of self-preservation disappears along with the self-indulgent and self-destructive negativity of possession by evil. In place of this dilemma of opposites, an ego-transcending and world-transcending or cosmic nature-transcending equanimity appears. And in that equanimity, there is an inherent self-radiance that transcends the egoic dualities of good and evil, or the conventional polarities of the separate self in conditional nature. That self-reliance, that self-radiance is the free radiance of egoless love. In that free radiance, energy and attention are inherently free of the ego bond, or the self-contraction, or the gravitational effect of phenomenal self-awareness. Therefore, dynamic equanimity, or the free disposition of egoless love, rather than the egoic disposition in the modes of good or evil, is the window through which the real, a causal God, may be seen or intuited, not in the conventional mode of creator, the good, the other, or the heavenly place, but as the real or reality itself, the self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of all and all. The ultimate moment in the play of conditional nature is not the moment of egoic success or the temporary achievement of the apparently positive or good effect. The ultimate moment is beyond contradiction or the dynamics of polarized opposites. It is the moment of equanimity, the still point or I in the midst of the wheel of nature's motions, and all the motivations of the born self. The truth and the real self-nature, self-conditioning self-state of self and cosmic nature is revealed only in that equanimity, beyond all stress and bondage of energy and attention. This disposition of equanimity or free energy and attention is basic to the 6th and 7th stages of life. In the 6th stage of life, the disposition of equanimity provides a functional base for the ultimate and final investigation of the ego and the dynamics of conditional nature. However, it is only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life that fundamental and intrinsically egoless equanimity is inherent and constant, expressing prior and permanent divine self-realization. It is in the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life that real a causal God, truth itself, or reality itself, is intrinsically obvious, prior to every trace of egoity, dilemma, and seeking. Therefore, it is in the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life that real a causal God is truly proclaimed, not in the conventional mode of creator or of good, but as the real or reality itself. Real a causal God is the transcendental, inherently spiritual, and self-evidently divine truth, reality, identity, self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of egoic self and conditional nature. In the only by me revealed and given 7th stage of life, that is tacitly obvious, and there is not anything that must be escaped or embraced for the love bliss fullness of most perfect real God realization to be actualized. Is inherently so. Therefore, the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam is not any egoic means for attaining real God realization. Rather, the only by me revealed and given reality we have added down, is real God realization itself, through ego transcending locating and knowing of my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace, beyond all the methods of the first 6 stages of life. Real a course of God, or the transcendental inherently spiritual intrinsically egoless and self-evidently divine reality, prior to conditional self, conditional world, and the ego-bound conventions of religion and non-religion, is the one and only truth of reality itself, and the one and only way of right life and perfect realization. Da, da, da.